Endeavor, Horizons of the Infinite. Endeavor to Cure the Sick. By Elton Garr. Before she joined the Endeavor, Dr. Ramsey did the math. There were 312 people on the ship. Assuming each person needed to see her roughly twice a year, that should be 2 patients a day, with the only other disruptions being the away parties, physicals, inoculations for visiting new planets, and a few other minor responsibilities. Of course, all of that assumed that the crew wasn't filled with morons who couldn't get through their day without injuring themselves. But as a scientist, it was her job to adjust her hypothesis when confronted by real-world data. On the Endeavor, the data was that the crew was riddled with dullards who couldn't keep themselves free of injury and disease. The worst was Alonzo. In the month since the Endeavor had launched, he had visited her 7 times and 3 times in the last week. He was a hypochondriac. He had become convinced the scratch on his hand was infected because his eyes were too dry, and had even come in because someone else had sneezed. She was hunched over a petri dish, adding in a few drops of the best growth medium when he walked in. The only thing she had from Intra were the microbes in the dirt on her shoes, but they might be the key to getting her promoted off the Endeavor. She just needed to grow enough for a good sample. For now, there was only early-stage growth with an irregular spread. Enough to be convinced she wouldn't lose the whole sample, but not much more.
Dr. Ramsey, I believe I have discovered the source of my underlying health issues,
Alonzo said, not bothering to ask if he could come in. The damn captain had an open-door policy that insisted that people be free to go almost anywhere, except personal quarters, as they wished. Which meant that when she locked the doors to the infirmary, the damned ship's AI just opened them. She turned to tell him that there was no underlying health issue, because he was just an idiot who shouldn't be allowed unfettered access to her time. As she turned, she caught the rough edge of the petri dish with her lab coat and knocked it to the ground.
Damn it,
she grumbled, grabbing it. Half the contents of the dish had fallen onto the metal floor of the infirmary, but she had saved enough of it. And who put metal floors in an infirmary? People needed to rest.
Do you want me to clean that up?
Alonzo said as he approached her, thinking he could help. Unlike her, he wasn't wearing a mask or gloves, and she hissed,
Get back. That's a sensitive and highly valuable biological sample, not a broken piece of machinery.
He backed away, and hopefully hadn't done too much damage, as she added a few more drops to her sample, put the lid on, and put it back in the incubator. She then turned to the engineer and said,
What do you think it is this time, Mr. Hawks?
Do you remember when I was sent to the automated relay station to repair the satellite array?
Shockingly, I don't actually pay that much attention to your engineering duties, as I am constantly forced to deal with people who can't be convinced they're perfectly healthy,
Tessa said, hoping that he might get the hint.
Well, I was. And it's been there for 50 years. Nothing but recycled air, grease, and a few loose wires. Something must have grown there, and
you got a shot when you got back. But even if you didn't, you'd be fine. Things that infect humans are caught from people, not sealed environments with nothing alive in it. Was there even any water?
It used a Terraform CryoReg 2912 cooling system. Over-engineering at its worst. A system out here doesn't need water cooling, but someone slapped it on. I had to replace several sections too.
And was that water filled with a growth medium?
Typically they use deionized water because it reduces wear, but
nothing. You're not sick.
Then why is my mind racing? I was doing some research in the medical texts, and
I restricted those texts after the last 3 times,
the doctor said. This time the engineer looked embarrassed, and he said,
I got a personal copy of the Pulse. I needed to know if.
The doctor grabbed a syringe, then put it down and grabbed one with a bigger needle. If he was going to insist, then she could at least make it hurt more. She then gave him a cocktail of everything she might give someone going to a planet. Vitalis had entire research departments dedicated to this, and she was wasting it on someone who wouldn't leave the ship for at least 2 weeks. But perhaps it would get him out of her infirmary. She jabbed him in the shoulder harder than she needed, then handed him the cotton. He could damn well deal with it himself. She had work to do, and she returned to her experiments without bothering to explain. After the last 3 times, if he hadn't figured it out, he wasn't going to. With that done, she sat down at her desk. As she wrote pointless notes about her patient, she relaxed. At least now that Alonzo had shown up, he probably wouldn't bother her again, so she could get some work done. Her first instinct was to return to the petri dish. It was by far the most important thing in the infirmary. Likely, the most important thing on the ship. But it also needed to be left alone, so she checked her other ongoing experiments. The samples of the biological AI were locked away with the more dangerous medical supplies. The samples were less illegal than the functioning biological AI, and as their first officer had pointed out, they weren't in the Commonwealth, but the captain may not care where they were at, and he could enforce any laws he wanted. She had barely gotten it under the microscope when the door chimed. Why did these idiots insist on making her answer the door when they knew it was open? Well, at least she had time to secure the sample first.
Open,
she said forcefully once she had the sample secure. Captain Adrian Watt walked in. She had only seen the captain a handful of times in the month that she had been on the Endeavor. Most of those had been to tell him that no, she didn't want to have meals with him or the senior staff. She was far too busy to waste her time explaining what she was doing to people who wouldn't understand. And she mentally prepared herself for another explanation of why it wasn't useful.
"How is your day going, Doctor?"
Adrian asked, not showing any signs of emergency, which made her question why he was bothering her.
full of meaningless interruptions.
Dr. Ramsey said, trying to work out how she was going to get promoted off the Endeavor if no one allowed her to do her research.
"Well, I hope this is another meaningless interruption. I need you to look into some odd behavior,"
the captain said. It took her a moment to work out why he wanted it to be meaningless, but she got there. If it was meaningless, then it meant that nothing was medically wrong. It also meant it was likely to be entirely useless. Unless, of course, it let her run a few basic experiments on the crew to make sure that nothing was wrong. It wouldn't be as useful as her other research, but a baseline could allow for more interesting experiments later.
What are the symptoms?
Anger, showing up late to shifts, impulse control, and there was a fight in the mess hall,
the captain said.
And you think that's unusual? This is a small enclosed community, stuck together in a high-stress environment. And unlike a cargo ship, it's filled with high achievers. Get used to some amount of strife, but in my medical opinion, sometimes the best treatment is to avoid aggravating the problem.
"I understand your skepticism. But if there isn't a medical reason, then I'll have to reprimand Commander Hester, and I would prefer not having her stab me in my sleep,"
the captain said. Based on what she knew of Commander Hester, it was possible that she was the one who had gotten into a fight, although if Commander Hester had lost control, it was likely the doctor would have already known. With Tabitha's physical augmentations, there either would have been broken bones or an autopsy to perform. It also seemed unlikely the captain would have made a joke about her violently attacking him if she had already done that. Or perhaps it wasn't a joke if he really thought there was something impacting the crew's mental health.
Leave a sample of blood, and order anyone you think is likely affected to come here.
The captain was marginally more capable than most people, which meant he could get a blood sample and probably didn't even destroy the cells. As soon as he was out of the room, Tessa said,
I assume you're eavesdropping again.
It is my job to monitor all important.
I don't care.
The doctor said, interrupting the ship.
Since the corporations wouldn't spring for a nurse, you're it. Send me a drone that can take blood samples without leaving too much on the floor. And just in case the captain is right, have a second one for security.
Shall I also implement quarantine procedures?
It was tempting. Not so much because there was any point, but because it would make the captain hesitant to bother her with something like this next time. But having people dying because the captain didn't want her overreacting would look bad on the evaluations, so she said,
If there is anything on the ship, everyone has already been exposed. But if anyone acts erratically, you have my permission to isolate them for their own protection.
The ship's AI could already do that if it felt it was necessary. Protecting the crew was one of its primary functions, but it sometimes seemed hesitant to take drastic measures, and having the official recommendation of the ship's doctor should make sure it acted appropriately. And if one or two people got tossed in isolation because the captain wasted her time, that might teach them something. By the time that Commander Hester made it to the med bay, the doctor had the captain's blood being processed and was trying to get some paperwork done. Commander Hester was one of the few people who the doctor had a reason to see regularly. Besides her being in charge of crew morale and the two working together on away missions, she also had pushed the limits of her body with the genetic alterations and needed daily injections of Modivane to tamp down the side effects. And while the woman could inject herself, incorrect dosages could cause physical and even mental side effects. So it was better to have the doctor monitor it than having the first officer be compromised. She was also less irritating than most of the crew. Perhaps it was that she understood medicine better since she worked for Helix Biologics. Helix was the only rival for Vitalis, though Terraform Incorporated was getting better at using biological agents to aid in terraforming worlds. Most of the time she came in, sat, and then left after she got her shot without bothering to even say hello to the doctor. A near-ideal patient, as well as a rare chance for the doctor to study genetic alterations. Perhaps someday Helix might get good enough at them that Tessa would consider being augmented herself. But outside of life extension technology, none of them were worth the risk to her or her career with Vitalis. Because while, officially, there were no corporate rules against genetic alteration, people who got them didn't get promoted. This time the woman stormed in and said,
I am told I have to let you violate my privacy with your primitive witch doctoring, or the captain will throw a roadblock in my corporate career. As if getting stationed on this ship isn't roadblock enough.
So perhaps the captain was right. Commander Hester had a paranoid streak from her time as an undercover agent for Helix Biologics, but she wouldn't insult the doctor or Vitalis Health Consortium. It wasn't good politics.
I just need a blood sample and a quick brain scan,
The doctor said, moving towards Tabitha with the same tool she used several times before to get a baseline for her brain activity. That baseline was going to be crucial if there was something wrong with the commander. But the doctor didn't get to see how it compared because the small blonde woman grabbed her by the wrist and twisted. The doctor didn't fight Tabitha. Dr. Ramsey wasn't combat trained or genetically augmented. But Tabitha still twisted hard. There was a loud snap, and pain overwhelmed the doctor. The two drones in the room both moved for the commander as soon as they saw the attack. One still had a syringe in their hand. But while the commander wasn't stronger than steel, she was faster and dodged between them. Then, thankfully, stormed out of the room. A few seconds later, enough adrenaline kicked in that the doctor could get to the painkillers. There were a few that were probably safer to use, but she needed to stay alert, so she used Indoramine. It was designed for soldiers, and the cocktail would allow them to run themselves to death without even noticing they were tired. Within seconds, the pain was gone entirely. She was still injured, but could ignore it for a few hours. And those few hours might be the most important in her career. If this really was a virus from Intra, a world much more evolved than Earth, then it would be far harder to cure than most viruses. And if Vitalis could turn it into a weapon and sell it to the military, that would be the exact type of thing that someone got promoted for. Because while biological weapons wasn't what they wanted to be known for, it was at least as profitable selling them to the military as traditional medicine.
Doctor, shouldn't we warn the captain that Tabitha may injure other members of the crew?
Security isn't my job. I spilled that culture earlier, and it must have infected Alonzo, who is spreading it to the crew. But I still need to isolate it. Without that, all I am is some idiot who dropped a petri dish. Get me Alonzo. And secure that door. I don't want to be bothered.
The captain wishes to speak to you,
The Endeavor's AI said. She suspected the Endeavor was ignoring her orders, or at least circumventing them. But she could work and talk.
I hear things are rough down there. Can I help?
The captain asked. It seemed obvious she needed full autonomy to deal with this, so she said,
I'm declaring a medical emergency, and as Chief Medical Officer and Liaison to Vitalis Health Consortium, I'm taking command.
There was a moment, then the captain said, his voice still cheerful.
I wish I could comply, but I don't have control of the Endeavor. Regan wanted to see how fast the Endeavor could go, and she locked us out of the navigational controls. When I asked Patch to fix it, he said something I won't repeat about commanding officers, and that he needs to focus.
While he was talking, 2 drones brought in Alonzo, one holding him by each arm. He had scratches on his arms where he had tried to break free of the robots, and he was showing all the signs of panic. The doctor glanced at him, then at her notes and said,
Excellent. It turns out you might actually be sick with something interesting. And a simple craniotomy should let me get a tissue sample to solve this.
A what?
Alonzo said, barely able to get enough air to talk.
Don't worry. The brain doesn't have any pain receptors, so you'll barely feel it once I'm past the surrounding tissue. And I'll try to limit the neurological impairment.
Doctor, I believe you may have been compromised.
The Endeavor said. Of course it would say that. No computer had ever truly understood greatness. But it didn't matter. This was a medical emergency, and the ship's AI couldn't override her medical decisions.
I am going to look at that man's brain. If he's not secured, there will be far more damage.
The doctor said.
Doctor, do you believe his permanent impairment will advance your career?
Intra has the most advanced biology the Commonwealth has ever encountered. Vitalis will overlook anything if I can unlock its secrets.
What if that's not the cause?
The Endeavor asked. Tessa had never even considered that. But the damned AI had a point. If it was her specimen from Intra, then she'd be a hero, but if it was just some other virus, it would be practically worthless. Any doctor could deal with a normal virus. So she said,
Fine. Take a blood sample. But make it fast.
Alonzo continued to struggle, but the drones pinned him to the chair long enough to get blood from his arm. The doctor couldn't help but be disappointed as she examined the blood work. It was far more primitive than she had hoped. Not even up to the typical standards of Helix Biologics. That was because they hadn't done it. It had all the signature signs of Terraform Industries technology. Her best guess was that they had been hired to build relay satellites and had used them as an isolated system to grow thousands of different strains of a virus in hopes some would be useful. But if so, they would be disappointed. Once it was isolated, it would only take a half-competent doctor a few minutes to create a viricide to cure it. It hadn't affected her, of course, but she might salvage something. The effects of the virus, while not entirely unique, had spread quickly, and if they hadn't been lucky enough to have a doctor who wasn't affected, it might have been too fast. With that done, she decided it was probably best if she dealt with her own injury. She still couldn't feel any pain, but her hand had begun to swell, so she checked for dangerous injuries, then secured it. By that time Alonzo had begun to calm, and she said,
Are you feeling more like yourself?
He glanced around the room and said,
I may have overreacted.
She didn't answer that. She simply turned to the nearest drone and said,
Prepare the same dose for everyone else on the ship.
You should take it as well.
The Endeavor said.
Nonsense. I'm clearly unaffected.
The doctor said. The drone tilted its head, then the Endeavor said,
While that may be true, you could simply be asymptomatic. Better that everyone gets the shot so you don't accidentally have another outbreak.
She nodded and said,
Very well. But keep him secure. I'm still going to want a brain sample for my report to Vitalis.
I understand.
The Endeavor said, and it gave her a shot.
Watch it, you lout. I've seen first-day med students give shots better than that.
Dr. Ramsey said, and sat down at her desk, beginning to think about how she had been acting. Perhaps she had gone just a little overboard. Author's note.
I like the episodes of space operas where the crew gets sick and goes insane. It's a great way to explore the personalities of characters because while heightened, it's still their personality. And I think it worked well to allow me to explore the Doctor's willingness to push limits without making her a real villain long term. I almost continued the story, but I restrained myself. Because outside of an apology or two, there just isn't that much more that needs to be said. Even the cure is secondary to how they react to the sickness. So when that was over, so was the story. If you enjoyed this story, I'm a week ahead on Patreon, so if you join at any paid level, you can read the next story in this saga, as well as over 60 patron-exclusive short stories. Thank you. Elton Gar.